People of color competing at work. It's a complicated maze to walk through. Thanks for tuning in to Women in Color. I'm Cheryl, and I'll be joined by my co-hosts Shernette and guests Nicole and Vanessa. In this last episode of Black Women in Education, Vanessa and Nicole will share their trials and their triumphs in getting to the roles that they now hold. We'll also examine how systemic racism in education shapes the complicated ways that Black and racialized people work together, sometimes supporting, sometimes sabotaging. And we'll also touch on code switching as a difficult but sometimes necessary survival skill when there are few people of color at the table. But first, listen to this.
I was working at one of the most prestigious Ivy League universities in New York. And doing so, one would assume that you're entering into an environment of open-minded, forward-thinking individuals. And it's shocking when you step into that environment and you realize that you're actually in the complete opposite situation. I have so many experiences at that one institution of racism and inequality that I lost count. But one that really does stick out to me, and one that I'll never forget, was literally sitting in a meeting with one of the high-level members of the administration and hearing that person say, "We will be showing preferential treatment of students to potential employers." That particular school within the university actually acted as a facilitator for job opportunities, for internships for students. And this individual shared with a small group of people in a closed-door office, nothing written down, shared the fact that some resumes would be presented over others, even though the school conducted open call interviews, leading the students to believe that they had an equal opportunity. It hurt so deeply to actually watch it physically play out, because I had one Black student whose grade could not be matched. She was articulate, she was forthright, she knew what she was talking about, she had researched that employer, she was ready, she was willing. And then a white student who wasn't quite sure of the path she wanted to take, a very smart student, wonderful person, but just did not have the focus for that particular employer, and literally submitted her resume in admittance to me because she just wanted to show that she was making a choice of some kind. And the administrator not only chose her resume, but literally spoke to the potential employer in private about the white student over the Black student. I remember thinking, what can I do? What can I say? I had nothing in writing. I had nothing recorded. I had nothing. I think about both of them to this very day. I think about the white student who took the job and wonder how she's doing and where she is and if she's found her path, which I'm sure she has. If not, a wasted opportunity. And I think about the Black student, if she's still searching, if she's found her path. And I think, when will this ever end?
Well, I'm a tenured professor at a university, and I think one of the first experiences that I had in the role that I currently have with people not being entirely supportive would be regarding the types of courses that I teach. I was asked to teach courses that weren't in my area of expertise. And in particular, I was being asked to teach a lot of courses on race and ethnicity. And I know that white colleagues who were hired at the same time as I was weren't being asked to teach these particular courses. So I think sometimes when people do that, they make assumptions about your skin color and make assumptions about what it is that you know or should know, and assume that you'll be able just to pick that up and talk about it. And at the end of the day, it kind of sets you up on a different level a lower level than your colleagues who don't have to teach in areas that aren't familiar to them. I can think back to being in graduate school, for instance, and having to get the support from my program to teach courses and to take up a teaching position in the university. And at that time, my funding had run out from the program, and I needed a way to feed myself and pay rent. And I had to approach the program to get permission to teach. And I was told by a white male program director that the program wasn't going to give me permission to teach and also be a grad student finishing up their doctoral work because, in his assessment, I wasn't a star. At that point in my doctoral education, that was a huge blow. I went to graduate school and there was only one other Black person, two other Black people actually, but one of them left the program early and then there were just two of us. And then that student graduated a couple years before I did. So I feel like the real formative years of my graduate career, I was alone. That white program director, he got in my head. And I remember that day
Wow.
I walked home in tears. It was a pretty long walk, and I was convinced that I had no business being in grad school, and that he was right. And I remember calling my parents and telling them what went down, and they were like, "No, you're where you should be."
The person, the individual you were speaking with, was disqualifying you for not having achieved something that you were actually on the right route to enhance your skills to achieve. I think that it's really important to identify that that is the problem. And it seems as though there was some kind of effort to disqualify you before you even had a chance to run the race.
And this just wasn't my experience. When I met other racialized and, in particular, Black scholars later on in my career, they would also tell me that in grad school, they weren't very successful in getting grants either. And they were talking about things or interested in things like race and discrimination, for instance. And they realized that no, their proposals weren't getting a lot of traction. So you're right in one way. I think grad school should be a place where you grow and you learn how to, yes, publish, and you learn about the ideas you think and everything like that. But it's become a place where they expect you to finish rather quickly and then automatically go into full-time work in the academy. And that's just not the route that's, I think, reasonable and realistic for a lot of bodies that are minority bodies in the academy. So when you're a grad student in the academy, these are obstacles, they're barriers, and I think unless you experience them, you don't believe that they are there.
So I'm an assistant principal at an inner city school. From the day it was announced that I would be taking the position, my colleague, she wasn't supportive at all. In terms of undermining me in front of the staff, going to my supervisor to complain about him putting me in the position, and just the constant backstabbing. It was really hard to deal with. I've had days where I cried and I just couldn't understand, like, God, why am I here? Like, this was supposed to turn out to be a really great experience for me. And it didn't feel like that. And then having a supervisor who loved the fact that I was intelligent, loved the fact that I was smart, but that's all that it was supposed to be. That's great as long as you don't show that to other people while you're in my presence. So like constantly feeling like I needed to like police what I said so that it didn't affect his ego. So I'll give you an example. So one day I was absent and he was like, I got everything. I met with the staff. We did whatever. So some of the teachers were doing a presentation the following morning. Unbeknownst to me, he pretty much approved everything that they were about to present. So while they were presenting, he opened up the floor for people to give suggestions. Me not realizing he already approved it, I had a lot of feedback to give because what they did wasn't correct. So later on that day, he pulled me into his office and he goes, what do you think about the way you behaved today? And I was like, excuse me? He's like, do you see anything wrong with your behavior today, the way how you came off? And I was like, no, like, what was the issue? Oh, well, you cut me off. I said, well, you opened up the floor to suggestions and I gave some feedback. Well, I just need you to be mindful in the future that while I'm speaking, it doesn't look good when you cut me off or contradict what I say. And I said, you know what? You're right. And I didn't even argue with him because I saw where it was coming from and what it was about. Mm-hmm. They were actually a Black female who was older than me and a Black male.
Okay. And that makes it really tough when it's someone who you identify with in terms of the same skin color, right? Someone that you think will be an ally, but then you realize they're not really an ally. So why do you think that is? What do you think that issue is about?
I think it kind of all stems from this idea that as Black people, we've been taught that there's not enough room at the top for everyone. Mm-hmm. And we've been kind of always pitted against each other. So it's like if one person shines, for some reason, I feel like that dims my light and I now have to find a way to outshine them. And I think, like I said, stemming back from what we've been taught, even during slavery and passed down, like this idea that Black people can't support each other. Like we always have to be cutthroat to get what we want. And I don't know if it's for acceptance or whatever it is, but I feel like it definitely sabotages a lot of relationships. I remember I was in charge of supervising a department that she didn't work with. And I remember her going to the department that I supervised and giving them a directive that was contradictory to what the plan was. And then when I called her out on it, she was like, oh, well, I'm just offering assistance. But always made a point to make it very clear that she was in charge of one thing. I wasn't supposed to touch whatever it was that she was doing. Mm-hmm. And just when I needed reports shared, she wouldn't send it to me. Just constant conversations that I overheard that she had, well, oh, she's new to this, or she doesn't know, or she doesn't know. It's always she doesn't know versus you taking a stance of being a mentor possibly and saying, okay, let me teach you how to do this. Right. It was always more of, I need to have one up on you because you need to understand that I was here before you. And, kind of like, I'm not willing to help you. You need to figure it out. But then getting upset when I did figure it out and didn't need her support. So I think there was also something there about this subordinate now being on the same level with me. She was also an older woman. So I think there was a piece of ageism there. But also this underlying insecurity, right? That she had some things, as I'm more reflective now, that she needed to work on. And instead of her working on those things, it was easier for me to take this out on you and hold you back because I need to be the only one shining in this spot. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to that notion that there can only be one. Right. I also realized the person that had my position before was a man. And my supervisor at the time was also a man. So she was the only woman. So she was able to, in a sense, shine and have that spotlight because she was the only woman. Here you are now, me being another woman, now you feel like you have to share that spotlight. And the things that you were able to get away with a man, you can't do with a woman because we now think the same. So I think it was a couple of things at play as I reflect and think back on the situation.
It just makes me think how many of us end up having to leave. And, when we look at the Black community from a larger viewpoint, you see leaving as a critical theme or a repetitive theme, I should say. The question is, how do we walk through the fire in a way where it benefits us now and in the long term and then generationally?
it's made me realize that sometimes what's more important are people's politics, as opposed to their race. Because, yeah, you can suffer a lot of harm from people who may look like you or, have the same skin color as you. But, as Vanessa's pointed out, people sometimes aren't very supportive of you, or they don't want to help you, or they don't want to be those mentors in the space, knowing that, hey, you're coming up after me. I want to share with you the knowledge that I have. So sometimes, sadly, it's about people's politics and the type of people that they are, and how they're willing to help, and more importantly, why they're willing to help you. And I say the why because people have to be willing to help you for a reason. That's not about their own self-interest. So I find that the politics are important, and I'm willing to roll with anyone who has a politics that is inclusive and that recognizes, the differences and the nuance. So I think that's how I approach a lot of things now in my career, and I try to be mindful, especially when I witness things and when I hear stories like Vanessa's. It just kind of reminds me, to keep on looking for the politics, because there are good people out there. It's just that sometimes it's harder to find them in certain spaces.
I think of it in the terms of education and how I've been teaching it to kids and how I've reflected and shifted the way I taught it. It's the idea that Black people have to exist in this space of duality, right? Mm-hmm. So I am one way with my family. I'm another way when I come into work. Mm. A lot of times we're working in white spaces where we have to kind of put on an entirely new persona, from the way we dress to the way we speak, our tone. So the ability to navigate between these two spaces is what we call code switching. As I've come to do some more self-reflection, do more reading and research, I realized for myself, I feel like I've been teaching the concept wrong. A lot of times you teach code switching as a way to gain access into spaces that traditionally Black people have not been given access. What I've come to now do when I teach children about code switching is the idea of gaining access so you can now dismantle the system and make it comfortable for who you are outside of that space to be okay. In most white spaces, not most white spaces, white people don't ever have to think of code switching. They are taught, they're raised to be who you are in whatever space. However, when it comes to us in spaces, we are not allowed to be ourselves. Therefore, we take on this second self. Mm-hmm. So I've now been teaching children that there's nothing wrong with you, mm-hmm. but understanding that there's certain norms that govern this space. That's great. Learn those norms. Hold on to who you are. But once you get there, you now have to make that space comfortable to who it is that you are and be comfortable in that space.
When you're navigating a lot of these white spaces that are telling you your body is not a part of this space, or it's an unfamiliar body in this space, you sort of have to adopt the language and the movements of whoever has normalized that space. So it's a very tricky thing. And on one hand, it is survival. On the other hand, the way that I look at it is it keeps on communicating to me who I am. And it keeps communicating to me the spaces where, as Vanessa said, I have to insert myself more. You make choices on, okay, am I going to say something in this meeting? Am I going to use the physical and emotional energy that I have to break it down for these people and tell them that this idea that they've just proposed, it's no good. And it's actually not great for all students. And it's only going to service a certain type of student and not all, or be more inclusive. Because in some ways, you have to be really good at reading the room. There are a lot of people who just don't want to listen to talk about what diversity actually means. And there are a lot of people who write about diversity, but one of the things that's always stuck with me is that diversity means that we should still be able to talk about racism. So for me, navigating these spaces and code switching sometimes is important, because in some ways you want to be able to infiltrate. You want to be able to maybe plant a seed. And I think importantly, you want to be able to see who in the room might have a politics that you can work with. Someone who's going to understand the importance of the issues that you raise, even though the majority of the people in the room don't want to talk about those things. So yeah, it's a very very thin tightrope, or a thin line that I feel that I walk sometimes. And the only way that I can sort of get through it is to, talk with other people who might have been in that meeting or that space afterwards about what went down, and maybe how we can go into that space again and use one another as a support to say certain things in meetings that raise certain issues that maybe the room isn't ready for. But sometimes it makes a huge difference if it's more than just one person sticking their neck out there and naming the things for what they are.
When you think about this idea of infiltrating the space, it's finding opportunities for you to be able to speak up and to speak about what is happening in the space that may not be inclusive of everyone. But it definitely has been taught as a survival technique. But I think that has also been one of the generational curses, I would say, that has been handed down to us, that we've been taught how to survive. We now need to learn how to thrive in spaces. So now when I think of teaching code switching, is not from a point of survival, but now that I'm in this space, I'm working here, how do I now make it comfortable so that I can be my best self? I feel like for too long, people of color get into spaces and we're always walking on a tightrope. We're never in the space and feel at ease in the space. So I feel now the challenge is, how do I now find peace in this space, although I am surrounded by all these white supremacy ideas, all these ideas that speak to whiteness. But even thinking of when you're in spaces and there's a tone, right? When you walk into buildings, it needs to be quiet. Us by tradition, like, we're not a loud people, but when we talk, we get excited. We're passionate, right? Why is our passion always viewed as something negative, right? Oh, they're angry. But this other white guy over here, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, but that's passion. But getting comfortable being like that and not feeling a way when people comment about it, or getting to a point where you can now come back. Well, why is what I'm doing being viewed as being aggressive, but this person did it and we didn't see anything of think anything about it? So getting comfortable with making people uncomfortable with the things that they say. We have to get to a point where I'm willing to challenge and not feel away. And although a lot of my experience has been with other people of color, they have also swallowed and drank the Kool-Aid of white supremacy, because even where I am now, I watch how even people of color try to police a lot of the children that I deal with. Oh, they're so loud. Why does she have to speak that way? So what if she's loud? Does it take away from the fact that she's intelligent and brilliant and has ideas to share? Then let her be loud. Like, it doesn't matter. Or we got into a debate recently about our young girls wanting to wrap their hair in traditional African cloth. My supervisor had an issue with that. Oh, they need to comb their hair. I said, do we say that to Muslim girls when they wear the hijab, or when someone puts a yarmulke on their head? Why is it that when children that look like you want to embrace and express who they are, we see it as an issue? And the only thing I can go back to is, again, although we look how we look, a lot of us have ingested the poison of white supremacy and we spit it out and don't even realize it.
It's so hard to break out of that mindset because we're socialized, especially in many of the educational spaces that we learned in, to just take it, right? To conform. So it's very hard when you're different. And taking up space for me too doesn't just mean sort of being who you are, and unapologetically so, as Vanessa stated. Taking up space also means, how should we say, not being afraid to do it all the time. So it's not just a one-off thing. Taking up space is ownership. So when you take up space in one space, for instance, don't be afraid to do it in the other spaces that you go to. And I think that the more you start taking up your space, and I would say that a lot of my students who are younger than I am, they have a lot more courage than I did when I was their age to do so. They do it eloquently, they do it unapologetically, and they expect to be respected for who they are in every space that they go to. So I think sometimes it can be a very hard thing to do, but taking up space just isn't about one space. It's about every space. It's about the grocery store. It's about waiting in line somewhere. It's about your workplace. It could be even in your family, because I'm sure we can all relate to having different political opinions, especially when it comes to issues of race in our very families. And that can also be challenging too. So taking up your space is so critical. And I also think when it comes to taking up space, to sort of look for the people who are acknowledging you, look for the people who are accepting you, accepting the ways that you do that, because usually those are perhaps the people who are going to be supportive in other ways. Because if they accept you for who you are, and they're willing to learn more about you and the way that you're telling them you roll in a certain space, then that's your authentic self. And I think that when people start seeing more of the authentic self of bodies that are not the norm, so non-white bodies, Black bodies, then they're even going to start imagining that, for instance, Black bodies can be in power, they can be in leadership, they can be supervisors, they can be the teachers, they can be the people calling the shots, and so on and so on. So taking up space, it's just so critical.
I want to thank our guests for sharing their experiences today. If you are working in education and have your sights set on a leadership role, I want to encourage you to push through and reach your goals. The pressures of systemic racism are real, but you deserve to succeed. The reality is that we can be held back and hurt by those that look like us. It's an upsetting and traumatic outcome of systemic racism. But while you're pursuing your dreams in helping others, know that fixing someone else's trauma isn't your responsibility. If you're being bullied or policed or sabotaged, don't feel guilty for taking action. Speak to someone that you trust. We all deserve to work in a space that promotes equity and success for everyone. You might end up helping someone else going through the same struggle. Take up your space and hold on to it. Please leave your comments and your questions below, and don't forget to subscribe. Click the bell for notifications, and do pass this video along. And until next time, keep living in your color.